First, two of its oil tankers were attacked. Then Saudi Arabia saw some of its vital oil pumping stations targeted by Houthi drones. As tensions running high in the Gulf, what's really behind this series of attacks, and could it escalate into a bigger confrontation? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. It's the second attack in less than 48 hours. Two Saudi oil pumping stations were targeted on Tuesday, west of the capital, Riyadh. Houthi rebels say they carried out the strikes to warn the kingdom against what they describe as its aggression in Yemen. Saudi Arabia's state-owned energy company Aramco has stopped for the moment pumping oil through a major pipeline. The incidents come after two Saudi oil tankers were damaged in an attack off the coast of the Emirate of Fujairah. The Emirati government has also said that 4 ships were targeted off its coast. Well, the Houthis say the drone attack was their biggest since the war in Yemen began in 2015.
7 drones belonging to the Air Force of Yemen attacked pumping stations related to the strategic pipeline that carries oil from east to west in Saudi Arabia. It was a successful operation. We found assistance from people living in Saudi Arabia, and we had excellent intelligence. The attack has seriously damaged the economy of the enemy.
Well, Saudi Arabia's Minister of Energy, Khalid Al-Falih, has condemned the, quote, cowardly attack. In a statement, he said, this act of terrorism and sabotage, in addition to recent acts in the Arabian Gulf, to not only target the kingdom, but also the security of world oil supplies and the global economy. These attacks prove again that it's important for us to face terrorist entities, including the Houthi militias in Yemen that are backed by Iran. And this is what the US ambassador to Saudi Arabia, John Abizaid, had to say. We need to do a thorough investigation to understand what happened, why it happened, and then come up with reasonable responses short of war. It's not in Iran's interest, it's not in our interest, it's not in Saudi Arabia's interest to have a conflict. Well, the attacks come as tension is running high between the US and Iran. Washington has announced that it aims to cut Iran's oil exports to zero and has boosted its military presence in the Gulf in response to what it calls Iranian threats. But both sides have played down the possibility of an armed conflict. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, said that no war is going to happen, but has also ruled out negotiations with the US over Tehran's nuclear program. As for the US, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, we fundamentally do not seek a war with Iran. That's during a visit to Russia on Tuesday. Well, let's bring in our guests for today's programme. We're joined from Sana'a in Yemen by Nasser Arrabyee, Yemeni journalist and filmmaker. Via Skype from Reston, Virginia, Trita Parsi, professor of Middle East politics at Georgetown University and author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran and the Triumph of Diplomacy. And from Oxford in the UK, Samuel Romani, University of Oxford PhD candidate, regular contributor for The Diplomat and Washington Post. Gentlemen, good to have you with us on Inside Story. Samuel, let's start with you. Look, we'll talk geopolitics for most of the programme, but first I want to clear up a few things about these incidents. How were such relatively slow, unstealthy aircraft able to fly so far into Saudi Arabia undetected at a time of war? What does this say about Saudi air defences?
I think that it shows a bit about Saudi air defenses, but it also shows the degree to which the Saudis have underestimated the improvements in the ballistic missile technologies and drone technologies that the Houthis have made over the past 6 to 8 months. So now the Houthis have the ability to launch drone strikes at a radius of 900 kilometers with remarkable degree of precision. So in July of 2018, they tried to attack oil tankers in the Bab el-Mandeb, and they were unable to organize a major oil spill or anything of that level, but they just showed their intent and their ability to strike. Then, in January, they launched an attack on the Yemeni intelligence ministers, which led to his assassination, which is a lot more targeted and a lot more improved. But I don't think the Saudi air defenses have improved at the same level. I think they've actually been quite complacent about the degree to which Iran is either supplying the Houthis or the degree to which the Houthi capabilities are improving. So I think this was almost a wake-up call and a shock for the Saudis, partially due to complacency, as due to the improvements of the Houthi technology.
Trita Parsi, will you concur with that? What does this drone attack tell us about the Houthis' level of technical sophistication? Is it technology that they could have built and flown on their own, or would they have needed outside help?
Well, it seems unlikely that they would have been able to do this entirely on their own, although I think we also have to take into account that the war against Yemen by the Saudi authorities have been run with tremendous incompetence from the very, very outset. So for the Saudis to suffer a loss like this is not in and of itself uncharacteristic in this war. But it is quite clear, and it's not unusual as well, that as war goes on, both sides will try to advance their technologies and improve on them, and clearly the Houthis appear to have done so.
Nasser Arrabyee in Sana'a. What are we to make of the fact that it was economic interests that the Houthis targeted and not civilian areas in Saudi Arabia, albeit targets that were a similar distance to Riyadh from the Yemen border?
Well, first of all, Yemen is under aggression and blockade for more than 4 years, which means that we have now the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So this was a response to that aggression and the blockade, because when we talk about the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, we talk about 250,000 people who were killed. Most of them are women and children at homes, schools, hospitals, weddings, funerals, farms, and everywhere. And we talk also about 3 million Yemenis, homeless Yemenis. We also talk about 11 million who are now facing a famine. When I say a famine, I don't mean there is a drought in Yemen. No, it's Saudi-made famine, Saudi-made starvation that is used as a weapon of war. So we are talking about all these things. We are also talking about 100,000 people who already died now because of this starvation. We also talked about airports that are closed, yes.
Nasser, I get what you're saying here, but I want to focus for the meantime on the Houthi response to all of this and the attacks. Or the attack on the oil installations in Saudi Arabia, the fact that they were economic targets and not civilian targets.
Yes, this is this is not only this is the policy of the government of Houthi here from the very beginning. They never targeted any civilians in any place. They already launched many ballistic missiles, short and long range, and they never targeted civilians. Now they are targeting the economic interest because they already declared that we are not going to stand idle by and watch our people being starved and being killed, and we don't do anything. Of course, they know that the Saudi oil is behind all these things, behind the problems, behind the war crimes, behind the starvation, and behind this the worst humanitarian crisis, which is described by the United Nations as the worst in the world. Okay. So they targeted the economic interest deliberately, yes.
Samuel Ramani, you talked about the shock in Saudi Arabia after these drone strikes, the latest drone strikes. Do you think Saudi Arabia is reconsidering its position regarding the war in Yemen? After 4 years, it's pretty clear that they don't have the ability to defeat the Houthis. Neither can they prevent Houthi attacks on their own soil.
I think that this is a moment of reassessment for Saudi Arabia, but it should not be viewed as a moment of retrenchment. Because if you look at the Saudi response today, they're continuing with an even more intensified set of airstrikes on Al-Daleh. I think that this will just reduce the Saudis' trust of the Houthis, which is already extremely low. So the Yemeni government troops may well not withdraw from Hodeidah, and Hodeidah could ultimately end up being a renewed scene of warfare. Saudi Arabia will likely appeal to the United States to point to the fact that the Houthi threats about targeting Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh are actually serious now, and the Houthis could disable international oil markets, so they could try to lobby members of Congress to soften their opposition to the movement of arms to Saudi Arabia. So I think that this will in general lead to a more aggressive Saudi position in terms of airstrikes and not really the pushback that some people might be intending here, even though their airstrikes are clearly enabling and causing Houthi aggression, and the fact that they haven't really achieved anything substantial in this war since they recaptured Aden from the Houthis in late 2015.
All right, let's broaden the discussion out here. Trita, Parsi, are the attacks on the oil stations in Saudi Arabia and the sabotaging of the tankers near the Strait of Hormuz connected? And what are we to make of Iranian denials of involvement in either of those incidents?
Well, certainly on the surface, mindful of the timing, I can understand why there would be speculation that this has something to do with the fact that the U.S. is now aggressively pushing to push out all of Iran's oil from the international market and replace it with Saudi and American oil. That's understandable. But we also have other factors that we have to take into account. You have a government in Saudi Arabia that has, for more than 10 years, pushed the United States to go to war with Iran. You have a former Secretary of Defense, Bill Gates, saying that the Saudis want to fight the Iranians till the last American. You have a national security advisor in the White House who has a history of fabricating evidence in order to get the United States into war and was a key architect of the Iraq war. Given all of that, I think we have to look at these things that on a surface level looks like potentially being connected, but also realizing that there are very powerful elements that want to go into war with Iran and who are more than happy and have a track record to fabricate false flag operations in order to get that war. So we have to keep that in mind as well, because in some ways the timing is perhaps a little bit too coincidental.
Nasser Arrabyee, Iran's ambassador to the UK says that the Islamic Republic isn't involved in any attempt to destabilize the region. The Houthis have claimed responsibility for the drone attack. The UAE, as yet, hasn't said who it believes was behind the sabotage incident, while Iran says it suspects that it was Israel. I mean, if it wasn't Iran, who was it and what was their motive?
I think talking about Iran here in particular in this issue of the drones, talking about Iran is sort of sidestepping from the problem of Yemen, because now, given the aggression, given the war that lasted for now for about more than 4 years, is enough for Yemenis to retaliate and to do something, because talking about Iran is something that is not fair at all for Yemen. And Yemenis at the same time they said that it's them who did this, and they would do it more and more until this aggression and blockade stop.
Samuel Romani, I'll put the same question to you that I put to Trita a few moments ago. Are the attacks on the oil stations in Saudi Arabia and the sabotaging of the tankers in the Strait of Hormuz connected? And who do you think was responsible for that attack on the oil tankers?
I think that, realistically, all the fingers point to Iran. And we should be careful about the fact that the UAE and the Saudis have not officially blamed Iran, because this is a direct reaction to Jawad Zarif's separation of Trump from the Gulf countries. So if you look back at what he said recently, he said that it's the 4 Bs, including bin Zayed and bin Salman, who are enabling Trump to go to this war. So the Saudis and the UAE are probably holding back and waiting for the US to call it first, because they want to make it look like it's actually the US leading it and they're kind of coming from behind. That being said, I really don't see any other country that would have an interest in launching these attacks. I think that they're both largely related to each other, because Iran has viewed economic warfare against Saudi Arabia as a two-front war. So on the Bab el-Mandeb in the Red Sea and on the Strait of Hormuz. And the Gulf of Oman. That could even be a third area. So these are probably part of a broader strategy to show that if you continue to launch the war in Yemen and continue to strangle our oil exports, we'll retaliate in the oil markets, less than something that would cause a war like the Strait of Hormuz, but enough to destabilize and shock major oil exporters like Riyadh and Abu Dhabi.
Trita, Parsi, would you agree with that? I mean, by framing Iran as a provocative actor, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are hoping that the US does the heavy lifting, and that it's this B team that is trying to steer the US into conflict. National Security Advisor John Bolton, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, the UAE, or the Abu Dhabi's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed.
I mean, this is all well documented. You have Bibi Netanyahu giving press conferences and saying that we are now coming together with the Arab countries because we have a common interest in war. You have the WikiLeaks revealing what the King of Saudi Arabia said to the Americans, what MBZ consistently was telling the Americans in the 2010 period, in which they wanted war with Iran. And they didn't want a war that they would fight themselves. They wanted the Americans to fight it. So that's why I would disagree with the notion that Iran is the only potential suspect here, the idea that they're the only country that would benefit from this. No, actually, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and to a certain extent, some folks here in Washington as well, would very much like this war, and as a result, also have an interest in fabricating these things. And mindful of the fact that the key person in the White House right now on this file helped fabricate evidence that got the United States into war with Iraq, we have to keep that in mind and realize.
What do you mean? Explain that for me.
Well, John Bolton was very much involved in the fake stories about yellow cake and aluminum pipes, all of these different things that helped make the case for war with Iraq back in 2002. And he's still on the record saying that the Iraq war was a success. So there's a good reason to treat all of this with a tremendous amount of skepticism, precisely because some of these very same individuals helped trick the United States into war about 15 years ago.
And Nasser Arrabyee, what are we to make so far of Iran's reaction to this ratcheting up of tension?
Well, Iran has its own problems with the United States, and Iran said clearly that it was not involved in any of these two things. But I think again and again that talking about Iran, when we talk about Yemen and about the aggression and the blockade and the starvation and the famine and all these things, is not fair to Yemenis at all, because Yemenis now want to end this crisis, this problem, this tragedy. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are the ones who are killing and destroying Yemen for 4 years now. So it's unfair to say Iran is not killing Yemenis. If Iran is gaining, if Iran is benefiting from what's happening in Yemen, this is something. This is something to not up to it. But Yemen now is under bombings for 4 years. For 4 years, starvation and famine and all these kind of things. So we should, the world should listen to Yemen, to what's happening in Yemen. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, if they have a problem with Iran, they should go to Iran, not to Yemen. They are killing Yemen. They are destroying Yemen. This is the problem. This is the problem that we want the world to listen. And this is why Yemenis now, the army of Yemenis led by Houthi yesterday hit the economic interest in Riyadh yesterday. Just to tell the world, we are being killed. We are being starved. We are here for 4 years. And why you are now talking about only about these things that about the bombings and about the bombing stations of oil yesterday. So humans are more important than anything. So the only thing that can be done now is to stop the aggression and the blockade, and then everything will be okay. Yemenis will not attack. The Yemenis don't want to attack Saudi Arabia. They don't want to attack United Arab Emirates. They don't want to attack anyone, but they are defending themselves. They must defend themselves. This is what the world should know. This is what the world should listen to the Yemenis.
Samuel Ramadi, you talk about this split in the White House, this difference of opinion between the National Security Advisor and the President, one of whom seems quite keen to go to war, the other one a little more reticent. The US ambassador to Riyadh said that it's not in Iran, the US or Saudi Arabia's interests to have a conflict. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the US doesn't seek a war with Iran. So what is really going on here? What's this all about?
I think that, there should be a bit of caution when you're talking about the degree of differences in their opinions. I think certainly between Bolton and Pompeo, they have a very similar worldview and ideology with regards to the potential benefits of military action towards Iran. But I think that Bolton is a lot more of a long-term proponent of the unilateral use of military force, everywhere from Cuba to Venezuela to Iraq before that. with regards to Trump, I think that Trump is probably the person there who's the least likely to want a war, because during the 2016 campaign, he repeatedly pledged he would not want to get the U.S. into another nation-building mission or into another kind of war without end that would not benefit America's interests. And it's also interesting to note that during the campaign, he even praised Iran at one point as fighting ISIS and was critical of the Saudis. So his positions are all over the place. And it's very hard to tell whether or not he will actually be the person to go to war. I think that the voices of restraint from the ambassadors, from the diplomats in the State Department, and maybe even ultimately Pompeo, could prevent a major escalation from occurring. Because I think this is a lot about that we have to distinguish between containment and actual preparation for war, which is something that not enough people are doing.
Trita Parsi, with the US military build-up in the Gulf region, this tension building up right now, will the voices of restraint win out here? What are the dangers? How close are we to a full-scale military conflict?
I think actually that's the Iranian calculation, and I have a piece about that in NBC today in which I write that the Iranian calculation is that the voices of restraint, and particularly Trump's own voice of restraint, his instinct for not getting into these wars, will really not kick in until there has been this type of a mobilization, because that's the point in which the tensions between Bolton and Trump will come to its maximum. So essentially, it's cost-free for Trump to escalate right now and talk about moving troops, etc. But once it comes to the point of him actually making a decision to go to war, I think the Iranian calculation is that Trump will back off precisely for the reasons that was mentioned earlier on here. So I think we're moving towards this point, but there's a high likelihood that he will back off. He did back off on North Korea and adopted a completely different posture, that can happen. But the big risk is that some sort of fabricated accident happens in the Persian Gulf or in its surrounding areas, and that is then used by Bolton to really press Trump to do some form of a military attack and then sell it to him as a defensive measure. That's where I think what the Europeans and others are warning about right now.
Samuel Ramani, where does Iraq come into this? Sort of caught in the middle, even Qatar stuck in the middle as well. Does Iraq have a role to play as perhaps a mediator between the US and Iran here?
Iraq has been trying to carve out an important mediation role for some time. And even in 2016, at the start, after the al-Nimr execution, they called for mediation between the Saudis and the Iranians then. So they're stepping up their role with regards to diplomacy in eastern Syria. They're establishing good relations with both Iran and Iraq. They could be a potential mediator. Qatar is obviously concerned about this too, but ultimately I think the regional mediators that the U.S. might go to by default, and Iran has shown an inclination to accept, would be Kuwait and Oman, I think. They would probably be more significant in the long term in dealing with this than perhaps Iraq when you look at regional mediators, simply because they have more experience and they have more credibility, I think, from the Saudi side.
And Trita, one final question to you. How do you see the situation playing out in the next few weeks or months? Just how dangerous is the situation right now?
It is extremely dangerous. And I think we should not take it lightly at all. At the end of the day, as much as I do agree that Trump's instincts are towards restraint and he doesn't want to go into war, and what he's shown so far in other areas is that he's walked away from the brink at the last minute. But we also do know that Trump's impulses oftentimes override his instincts. And with his domestic challenges and other things happening right now, I think the risk for some miscalculation as well as the risk of some form of a false flag is very, very significant. And I find it quite noteworthy that the British commander that is in charge of the campaign against ISIS spoke out yesterday and said that they have not noticed any increased threat from Shia militias in Iraq or in Syria or from the Iranians, completely contradicting what the Trump administration is saying. And I think it's again a sign that some of the allies of the United States are worried that John Bolton is trying to fabricate an accident in order to actually trigger a much larger war, a war that would be to the detriment of everyone, including the Saudis.
Gentlemen, we must leave it. Many thanks indeed for being with us, Nasser Arrabyee, Trita Parsi and Samuel Ramani. Thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme anytime just by going to our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, Please join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.